Hello, and welcome to the show Writing in the Tiny House. I am on a mission to abolish the idea of the tormented artist by sharing what I know about writing, publishing, and just life in general, so that you can have the tools to produce the content that you have been eager to write. If you have the steps in place, you can produce a short story in as few as 3 months, or a novel in as few as 18 months. And hopefully, through the ideas in this podcast, you will have the wisdom to adjust that timeline if you need to. I am Devin Davis, the guy who lives and writes in a tiny house in northern Utah. Thank you for tuning in, and please enjoy today's episode of Writing in the Tiny House. Hello, and welcome to the show. Welcome to Writing in the Tiny House. I am your host, Devin Davis, and here we are, guys. Here we are. It is a beautiful August morning. The weather is becoming a little bit more agreeable, at least in my part of the world, and life is good. Just a brief update on my current work in progress. Tiz is undergoing a second round of developmental edits, and then I think it's going to be ready to send to my editor, which is super exciting. We like to see progress like this, and so I'm still hesitant to project a date that is going to be ready, but developmental edits don't take forever, and the artwork is finished, and so I think I can get it out as an ebook here soon. I mean, don't hold your breath, but it's fun to see progress on that. Today we are going to take a step in a different direction. It has been ages since I have done a book review. So if you remember, if you have been with us since the beginning of this podcast, I used to do a book review every episode, and I did a series on different major genres and why you should read them. And I included in those episodes a book that falls into that genre and did a review. So there are a million different genres, a million different subgenres, and books tend to fall into more than one. Oftentimes. A lot of times, if you get historical fiction, you can also have a romance storyline in there, and so that book falls into historical fiction and romance. And it seems that a lot of times, the books that kind of stick to one genre are sci-fi and fantasy. I am going to share with you my experience of venturing into the LGBTQ genre. Now, if you've been with the podcast for a minute, you know that I am a person who belongs to that demographic of people. This may come across as odd, but until very recently, I have never read a book that belongs to the LGBTQ genre. I've never done it, and there are reasons for that. The most prevalent of it is because of my exposure to characters who represent the LGBTQ community in movies and in TV shows. I'm going to take you through how this transformed and how we are growing and evolving. It was my experience that specifically gay characters were there to be laughed at. They were there for the comic relief, and they were not the main characters. They were always like a sub-character, and they always had some problem that we were there to laugh at. That's what they were. That's what they provided. That's what they served. Or, on the other side of that coin, if they were not providing the comic relief, and it was something that more accurately represented LGBTQ today or LGBTQ in the 80s or whatever, it was usually a story that was filled with violence and drugs and a bunch of relationship problems. And sometimes, I hate to come off as shallow, but sometimes I am more in the mood for something lighter than that. I appreciate shows like Pose or some other things like that that depict what being a member of the LGBTQ community was like back in the day. I think Pose takes place in the late 1980s, and it's good. It's gritty. It's accurate. As far as it being a good light time, that's not what it's there for. And that's what I wanted. I wanted something like that. So back in June, I decided to read my very first LGBTQ genre book. And now I'm 38. I have read a lot of books. It is been largely fantasy, largely sci-fi, and some historical fiction. That's kind of where I fall. And so, and some thrillers. So anyway, I reached out and there was a book that was floating around Instagram last year that caught my attention and was something that I was interested in. It's a gay thriller called Haus. And so the two main characters are a gay couple and it's a thriller. Because I already had these preconceived biases toward LGBTQ fiction, I took all of the themes in that thriller and kind of confirmed those biases. And so, I mean, this was a thriller. It had a lot of sex, it had a lot of drugs, and it had a lot of violence because it was a thriller. I mean, there's a murder, there's a couple murders. And so while I certainly enjoyed the experience and enjoyed the book, I allowed that to just kind of confirm my preconceived biases against LGBTQ fiction, which isn't fair. And then after I read Haus. By the way, Haus is written by P.J. Vernon. And now when I say that I read these things, I actually listened to them as the audiobook because I'm pretty convinced that I don't know how to read anymore. So all of these are audiobooks. So Haus by P.J. Vernon was my first ever LGBTQ book that I read, that I experienced. After that, I found the TV show Heartstopper, or at around the same time. I've already done an episode on writing in the tiny house about Heartstopper, about keeping things simple and subverting tropes, and the power that comes with just being honest and simple and direct. And I wanted something more like that. Heartstopper is very LGBTQ forward. It's the whole point of the show. And it is wholesome, it is honest, it is heartfelt, it's all of the warm fuzzies. I wanted to experience that in a book too. And I wanted to venture out of the Heartstopper universe in order to do that. So I read 6 romance novels in 4 weeks. And it was the coolest ever. I'm not going to talk about all of them in this episode. I'm going to talk about probably 5 of them or 5 of them. And guys, this was me venturing into the unknown. I mean, not only was it LGBTQ fiction, which is not something I had read before, but this was also romance. And I have never read contemporary romance in my life. And I am discovering that I'm missing out on this whole big wide world of the fun of romance novels. And I read so many of these just over these past 2 months. So we start with one that is called What If It's Us, written by 2 authors, Becky Albertalli and Adam Silvera. It's a story about 2 boys who meet in New York. One of these boys lives there. The other one is there as an intern. And they meet. It was this meet cute at a post office. And this is their story of falling in love. And I was sitting there toward the end of this book. So What If It's Us ends in an unexpected way. And there is a sequel called Here's to Us. My personal feelings is the first book could have just been 50% longer and included everything that was in the second book. I don't feel the second book needed to exist as a second book. But here I was just kind of in the middle of this duology, and I was thinking to myself, this plot is pretty basic, pretty uncomplicated, not a lot of heat, not a lot of misunderstandings, not a lot of complications. And yet, why can I not put it down? Why am I compelled to fill my spare time with this book? And so when What If It's Us was finished, I immediately downloaded the sequel, Here's to Us, by the same 2 authors. This is completely different from my experience of fiction up to this point, because I have been so exposed to fantasy and science fiction. I have a huge collection of novels that are so plot-driven. The plot themselves are the point of the story, or the point of the book. And so the plot is interesting, and it's filled with twists and turns, and it's filled with, like, murder and weapons and magic, and, you know, in the event of sci-fi, super cool tech and whatever else. But here I am completely engrossed in this simple, straightforward story And why was I so enthralled with it? It was because I was seeing this blossoming relationship that I have not read a lot of things in all of the fiction that I've read that documented a blossoming relationship. To read something that was so character based and so relationship based was completely new to me. And it really caught me off guard as something that I would 100% enjoy. So that is how What If It's Us and Here's to Us came into my life. The next book that I read was part of the Heartstopper universe, so I'm going to glaze over that. But the one that followed that is a book called And They Lived by Stephen Salvatore. This was another cool thing for me because the main character is non-binary. They still use the pronouns he, him. So this goes through the process of this young person starting college in a graphic arts designer or an animation program. He wants to eventually work for Disney. So he is a complete Disney fanatic. And this is him meeting, I don't think they get married, but meeting his partner and falling in love. That's all the whole story is. This book also takes some stylistic liberties, and I love a good stylistic thing. There's some it's just really yummy. There's an underlying fairy tale that ties in to the entire book, but the fairy tale is fun, and it's a really fun, different approach. With this book, the prose specifically and the dialogue, but mostly the prose, were delicious for me. Everything was snappy. Everything was intelligent. And like I said, this character was a Disney fanatic. And so all of the references from Disney were completely on point. And I was laughing out loud. And it was great. I mean, I still have some notes as far as some of the things that happened in the end go, but it was a super good experience. One to keep me moving forward with this obsession with diving into contemporary LGBTQ literature. The next one that I read was 1500 Miles from the Sun. And this book, it said in the introduction, I was not the target audience for this book. It said so in the introduction. This is the story about a boy of Mexican heritage who lives in Texas, who falls in love with a boy from California. In the introduction, it says that the book is largely dedicated to gay people of color, which is perfect. And I decided to read it anyway. I figured there would be some references and some things that weren't for me. And there were. There was a lot of Spanish in this book, but I appreciated the experience of reading it to see, I mean, this is fiction, but to see what the lifestyle was like for a child coming out and being a gay person of Mexican heritage in a Catholic school district. It was interesting to see. This book also had an amount of homophobia in it, and parts of it were a little harder to, there was definitely some feels in there. The character has a father who is not accepting of him, and there was an amount of that. And it made the story good. The ending of it was kind of open-ended, kind of loose. And so, I mean, with all of these books, I still have some notes, but it was good. So, because I am now trash for this type of fiction, I moved on to another one called All That's Left in the World. This is actually apocalyptic fiction. I've read apocalyptic fiction before. The book that comes to mind immediately is World War Z, which is not a novel, it's a mockumentary. I've read apocalyptic fiction before, and this is apocalyptic fiction that also has a gay relationship. And it was perfect. It's a boy who is already gay and another boy who experiences an awakening, who are surviving together and have shared trauma together as 85% of the population of the world dies. I definitely have some notes about some of the medical things and stuff. I think that the characters were written to be older than they said they were. They're supposed to be teenagers, and what was more believable to me was that they were more, mid-20s, which is fine. That happens a lot in fiction like this, I guess, or this has been my experience. So just to recap so that I get book titles and authors, because I don't think I did that with all of this. What If It's Us by Becky Albertalli and Adam Silvera. Here's to Us by the same two authors. And They Lived by Stephen Salvatore. And 1500 Miles from the Sun by Jonny Garza, and All That's Left in the World by Erik J. Brown. So All That's Left in the World, the apocalyptic fiction, it says at the end with some author's notes that the reason why the guy wrote this book the way he did, so he took a very careful approach to the setting of this apocalypse. But the reason why he wanted to write this book is because there was no good representation of LGBTQ characters in apocalyptic fiction. And he loves apocalyptic fiction. And so he wanted good gay characters. And so he wrote a book about it. And I like that. I like to see this diversity. I started this journey with some preconceived biases toward LGBTQ fiction because I thought that it would confirm the problems that was happening in like the 90s and early 2000s with gay people being represented in TV shows and movies and probably books too. And so I strayed away from it. Now I'm all about it. I think it's super great. So it just goes to show that LGBTQ is just another awesome genre with a ton of additional diversity in it. And the thing is, the books that I read were wholesome. 3 of them were romances, and that's what they were. They were contemporary romance. One of them centered around the romance and being gay and being part of an additional minority group. And like I said, the other one was mainly apocalyptic fiction. And so it applies everywhere. The thing that comes to my attention immediately is the 100% normalcy of these books. They 100% fit in the genre where they are. The apocalyptic fiction was an apocalyptic book. And these other romances, granted, I have not read a lot of romances, and I said that at the beginning of this episode, but I expect that as I read more, this will fit in there. So I encourage you to do the same. I encourage you to branch out and pick up one of these LGBTQ contemporary pieces and just dive in. It doesn't have to be filled with cliches. It doesn't have to be filled with drugs. It doesn't have to be filled with violence. And doing that, making the books fit with the genre, it is a good and a smart way to progress acceptance and tolerance of everybody and their differences. So that is all that I have for you today. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode of Writing in the Tiny House. Have a good day, guys. Bye. And that is it for today. Just a reminder that Brigitte, installment 1 of Tales from Vlador, is available on Amazon as an ebook and on Audible and Apple Books as an audiobook. And I provide advance reader copies of these short stories as I release them to my patrons. So become a patron today by visiting patreon.com/writinginthetinyhouse to support both my writing and this podcast. And lastly, be sure to follow me on social media. My Instagram is @AuthorDevinDavis, and my Twitter handle is @AuthorDevinD. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today, and have fun writing. We will see you next time. Run by copy editor Chrissy Barton, Little Syllables Editing is a reliable resource for anyone looking to improve their manuscript. Chrissy does line edits, copy edits, and the final proofread for experienced writers and newbies alike. Go to littlesyllables.com and reach out to Chrissy today. A link is in the show notes.